Hello Wannabe Mechanics. In this episode we replace the shock absorber and the brake pads on a 2013 Skoda Octavia III. You can also change the rotor during this operation if you find it necessary. The shock absorber is a hydraulic or pneumatic device that operates up to 1900 times per mile to stabilize the vehicle's handling and generate as much contact between the road and tires as possible. Without a shock absorber fitted, your springs would contract and expand continually till the energy stored in them is dissipated. This would make for one hell of a bouncy ride with handling that is completely unpredictable. The roles of shock absorbers are: braking nosedive control. As weight transfers forwards due to momentum under braking, the suspension helps to resist this shift and balance the weight transfer. Body roll. Left unchecked, a body would lean away from the direction of travel. This shifts weight and reduces grip. This suspension system helps support the body and resist the rolling motion. Traction loss. Traction loss can happen for a number of reasons, but on bumpy roads, the suspension forces the tires into contact with the ground, increasing grip. On cars with low ride height, you may experience scraping or bottoming out, where the car's body or tub comes into contact with the track. The suspension will help prevent this. Noticeable symptoms of worn shocks are car veering or sliding in side winds, uneven wear appearing on your tires, rocking, rolling and rattling, swerving and dipping when applying your brakes, excessive vibration in your steering wheel, and even delayed or longer stopping distances. Don't go anywhere guys, meet you back in the shop right after our short intro. Alright guys, let's get to work. The tools we will be needing for these operations are a 17mm socket and a brake bar to loosen the lug nuts, an M14 and an 18mm wrench to remove the bolt holding the steering knuckle to the strut assembly, a 7mm Allen bit to counterhold while loosening the nut holding the sway bar's link, a 13mm socket and a 17mm wrench to remove the brake caliper. You can also remove the free bolts holding the strut assembly with the 13mm socket. A 21mm socket with a hex hollow end to remove the shock absorber's nut, counterholding with a 7mm Allen bit. Also helps remove the bolts holding the caliper bracket. A 10mm wrench to remove the wiring mount. A metal wire brush to remove some of the rust. We eventually had to use a power drill as well. Two box end wrenches to compress the caliper piston if you don't have a press. One of them has to be an 18mm to help remove the sway bar's link, the tie rod and the bolt connecting the steering knuckle to the strut assembly. A 24mm by hex socket and a brake bar to remove the drive shaft's hub bolt. We are going to use a stronger 24mm brake bar just to be sure. An extender, two spring compressors, a file to remove rust from different components, two screwdrivers also for rust remover but also for other operations, a press to retract the brake caliper if you have one or just use the two box end wrenches. You will also need grease, anti-seize and brake cleaner, a ratchet wrench or an air impact wrench, a 16mm socket to remove the free bolts on the control arm, the new shock absorber, and of course the new brake pads and hardware. Loosen up the lug nuts using the brake bar and the 17mm socket. Jack up the car, remove the lug nuts, then place a jack stand and the wheel under it. Spray anti-seize on all the bolts and nuts you will have to remove. Place a bit to hold the rotor in place and thread 2 lug nuts as a secondary measure so you don't break the rotor's bolt. Ask someone to push the brake pedal while you loosen up the hub's bolt. Now you can loosen up the 24mm hub bolt. Remove the hub's bolt. Remove the 2 calipers bolts using a 17mm wrench and a 13mm socket. Pull the brake caliper firmly to compress the piston just enough for the caliper to slide off. Remove the 10mm bolt holding the wiring mount. Take out the ABS connector. Remove the caliper and place it aside or suspend it. Never let it hanging by the brake lines. Take out the old brake pads. Remove the 18mm nut holding the tie rod. Remove the sway bars link using the 18mm socket or wrench while counterholding with a 7mm Allen bit. Remove the tie rod. If you want, you can buy a cheap press to do that. We are using a hammer hitting the steering knuckle joint to release it. Usually that is enough. Remove the 2 21mm bolts holding the caliper bracket to the steering knuckle. Remove the rotor's bolt and remove the rotor with a hammer, only if you are going to change it as well. Our rotor was in good condition, so we decided to keep it and just remove the rust deposits without hitting it hard with the hammer, which could affect its structural integrity. This is where the rust deposits were located. You can easily notice the corresponding marks left by them on the inner brake pad. Use the brake bar and the 16mm socket to remove the free bolts on the control arm. Remove the drive shaft's outer CV joint. Remove the 18mm nut from the bolt connecting the steering knuckle to the strut assembly. Now that you got the nut out, you can loosen up the bolt using the M14 on the other side. As you can see now, there is an area free of threads and that there is a lot of rust on the bolt that we'll have to remove. A handy trick to remove the steering knuckle is to insert any Allen bit that fits between the two arms and then twist it to enlarge the gap so that the steering knuckle can come off much faster. It's easier to do this on the car instead of doing it on a workbench, especially if you have no help. Now you can use two hammers to take the steering knuckle off the strut assembly. Remove the weather strip and then the 4 clips holding the plastic covers. Remove the connector for windshield washer nozzle heater if you have the winter pack, and then the plastic cover on the side of the car that you are working on. If you want the plastic cover out of your way, you'll also have to take out the nozzle as well by pulling the holding clip. Loosen up the free 13mm bolts holding the strut assembly and just loosen up the 21mm nut until you have a couple of threads left. Do not totally remove it now. Take out the strut assembly, attach the spring compressors as shown and compress the spring. Only then you may remove the 21mm nut. Take out the strut mount, the coil and the rubber damper. Before you apply the components of the assembly back on, you need to compress the shock absorber up to 5-10 times. Tighten the 21mm nut using the 21mm socket with a hex hollow end, counter-holding with the 7mm Allen bit. Now you can release the spring. If you want to keep the original rotor, remove the rust deposit without damaging its surface. In time it will even up. Connect the steering knuckle back to the strut assembly and make sure it goes all the way in. When tightening everything, use the recommended torques if you have a torque wrench. Clean the rust off the bolt and thread it back in, then tighten it using the M14 and the 18mm wrench. Put the strut assembly back in after you've aligned the arrows drawn on the strut mount with the driving direction. Thread the upper bolts back in and tighten them using the 13mm socket. Apply graphite grease on the drive shaft and insert it into the wheel hub. Attach the control arm and thread the wheel hub's bolt. Tighten the 16mm bolts on the control arm. Connect the sway bar's link, pulling the sway bar downwards using a bar as a lever, and tighten it with the 18mm wrench, counterholding with the 7mm Allen bit. Apply grease on the caliper's guiding pins before putting them back in. Place the caliper's bracket back on, thread the bolts back in and tighten using the 21mm socket. Compress the caliper's piston using any of the two methods shown. Remove any rust deposits from the brake pads rails. Clean the rotor with brake cleaner and place the new brake pads. Don't worry, they will only fit the right way. Thread and tighten the new 13mm caliper bolts with the help of the 17mm wrench and the 13mm socket. Attach the tie rod back to the steering knuckle and tighten the 18mm nut. Apply some grease on the lug nuts. Put the wheel back on and hand tighten the lug nuts for now. Lower the car back on the ground, connect the strut assembly's dust cover and apply the final torque to the lug nuts. Again, ask someone to press the brake pedal while tightening the wheel hub's bolt and you are done. Great job, guys! Thank you very much for watching. Use the comments section for any questions or suggestions, and if you find our videos interesting, make sure you subscribe for the latest Wannabe Mechanic videos. Bye bye!